They say the Tigris ran black, not from mud, not from storm water, from ink. Soldiers were hurling manuscripts, thousands of them, into the river. 500 years of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy. The water darkened like night falling in the middle of the day. And then it ran red. But how did we get here? How did the greatest civilization on Earth fall in 13 days? To understand, we need to go back. 40 years before the Tigris ran black, a caravan of 450 merchants left Mongolia heading west. Loaded with gold, silk, and silver, they were not warriors. They were traders sent by Genghis Khan himself as a gesture of peace to the Khwarezmian Empire. The most powerful Muslim state in Central Asia, they never came back. The governor of Otrar, a border city under the Khwarezmian Shah Muhammad II, accused the caravan of espionage. He seized their goods, and then he killed them, all of them. 450 men slaughtered over a suspicion that was almost certainly a pretext for theft. Genghis Khan, the ruler of the largest land empire the world had ever seen, did something no one expected. He did not immediately attack. Instead, he sent 3 ambassadors to the Shah and demanded a simple thing: justice. Punish the governor, return the stolen goods, and there would be peace. The Shah's response would change the course of human history. According to the accounts, he had 1 ambassador killed. The other 2 he sent back humiliated. According to some accounts, their beards were shaved. In the steppe, that was not an insult, that was a declaration of war. Think about the absurdity of it. One governor of one border town made one decision, and it would eventually erase half the civilized world. 450 men were killed for a rumor, and when the most powerful conqueror on earth asked for nothing more than justice, justice, not war, the Shah chose contempt instead. Sometimes the end of a civilization begins not with an army, but with a single act of arrogance. He could have executed the governor. He could have sent gold and apologies. Instead, he humiliated Genghis Khan's ambassadors. That gesture of contempt would cost more human lives than any plague in recorded history. Standing in his palace in Samarkand, surrounded by generals who told him Genghis Khan was a barbarian from the steppe, who commanded tent dwellers and herders, the Shah laughed. He had the largest standing army in the Islamic world. He ruled from the Indus to the Caspian. What could a nomad possibly do to him? Within 3 years, he would be hiding on a small island in the Caspian Sea, alone and sick, stripped of everything, dying as a fugitive from the very man he had mocked. He confused the size of his palace for the strength of his kingdom. 1 insult. That was all it took. What followed was a flood. Genghis Khan swept through Central Asia with devastating speed. Bukhara, one of the great centers of Islamic learning, was burned. Samarkand, the jewel of the Silk Road, fell in days. Nishapur was so thoroughly destroyed that the Mongol Khan ordered the site plowed and planted with barley. Not rebuilt, not left as rubble, planted. He wanted the very idea of the city to disappear. And then there was Merv, once one of the largest cities in the world. The historian Ibn al-Athir recorded death tolls that may have reached hundreds of thousands, though modern historians debate the exact figures. What no one debates is this: civilizations that had taken centuries to build were being erased in days. We say the names quickly: Bukhara, Samarkand, Nishapur, Merv, as if they are just cities on a map. They were not. They were libraries, hospitals, observatories, madrasas. They were the places where the Islamic world thought, argued, discovered, and prayed. And they were gone. Genghis Khan died in 1227, but what he built did not die with him. His grandsons would finish what he started. And 40 years after the first insult, Their eyes turned toward the greatest prize of all, Baghdad. Let us talk about what Baghdad was, before we talk about what Baghdad lost. In the 9th and 10th centuries, while much of Europe was struggling through what historians call the Dark Ages, Baghdad was the most advanced city on earth. The House of Wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah, was the single greatest center of learning in the world. Muslim, Christian, and Jewish scholars sat side by side, translating the works of Aristotle, Galen, and Ptolemy from Greek into Arabic, preserving knowledge that Europe had already forgotten. It was here that al-Khwarizmi wrote his foundational text on algebra. The word algorithm itself is a Latinization of his name. Surgeons were performing operations centuries ahead of Europe. Astronomers charted the stars with instruments of stunning precision. The House of Wisdom maintained one of the most extensive library and knowledge-sharing systems of its era. Books cataloged by subject, copied by professional scribes, and lent to scholars across the empire. This was not a museum. This was the engine of human civilization. But by the mid-1200s, something had changed. The Abbasid Caliphate, once the most powerful Islamic dynasty in history, had hollowed from the inside. The Caliph, al-Mustasim Billah, was the 37th and last of his line. A man devoted to poetry, calligraphy, and palace concerts. His court sparkled with entertainers. What it lacked were soldiers. The military budget had been slashed. The walls of Baghdad had not been properly maintained in years. The treasury was full of gold. The armory was nearly empty. Allah says in Surah Al-Isra, "When we intend to destroy a city, we command its affluent, but they defiantly disobey therein." So the word comes into effect upon it, and we destroy it with complete destruction. The city that invented algebra could not count the swords at its own gates. In 1253, in the Mongol capital of Karakorum, the great Khan Mongke sat across from his younger brother Hulagu and gave him an order that would reshape the world.
Take everything from Persia to Egypt. Those who submit, treat them well. Those who resist, annihilate them.
Not a city, not a province, everything. Hulagu assembled an army that defied comprehension. According to historians like Rashid al-Din, the force may have numbered 150,000 soldiers, possibly more. But numbers alone did not capture what made this army terrifying. Chinese engineers brought siege weapons, catapults, trebuchets, naphtha launchers, machines that could crack fortress walls from a distance. Armenian and Georgian Christian kings sent troops. Turkic auxiliaries filled the flanks. Hulagu also traveled with his own teams of astronomers, administrators, and road builders. The army carried prefabricated siege equipment that could be assembled in days. This was not a barbarian horde. This was an industrial operation. Hulagu was not a raging warrior on horseback. He was an administrator of violence. Every city he destroyed was planned months in advance, with supply chains, fallback routes, and diplomatic leverage. Calculated before the first arrow was fired. The first target was Alamut. Alamut, the legendary mountain fortress of the Ismaili assassins. Perched on a cliff in northern Persia, it had been considered impregnable for nearly 2 centuries. Its walls had never been breached. In 1256, Hulagu surrounded it, and it fell. Inside those walls for nearly 30 years had lived a man named Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, one of the greatest astronomers and mathematicians of the medieval world. He had resided at Alamut under debated circumstances. Whether captive or voluntary guest, historians have argued for centuries. What is not debated is what he did next. As the fortress collapsed around him, al-Tusi gathered his manuscripts. Astronomical calculations, philosophical treatises, mathematical proofs, the positions of stars, the rules of geometry, the architecture of the heavens. all written in his hand over decades. Mongol soldiers pushed past him in the dust and smoke. He did not run. He walked straight to Hulagu's tent and offered his services. Some call that betrayal, others call it survival. But had he refused, the science he carried in his head, science that would later influence Copernicus, would have died too. Sometimes the cost of preserving knowledge is your own reputation. He could have refused Hulagu's offer. He could have died in the rubble with his dignity intact. Instead, he looked at the man who had just destroyed his world and said, "I can be useful to you." That single sentence saved centuries of astronomical knowledge and stained his legacy forever. 20 years later, at the Maraghe Observatory in Persia, al-Tusi's students would create the most accurate star catalogs in the world. His mathematical models, the Tusi couple, would appear in the work of Copernicus over 2 centuries later. The man who walked out of Alamut with scrolls under his arm carried seeds that would bloom in places he never imagined. But in that moment, in the rubble of 1256, none of that mattered. With Alamut gone, there was only one prize left. When word reached Baghdad that Hulagu's army was marching west, there were exactly 3 men in the caliph's palace who would determine the fate of the city. The first was Caliph al-Mustasim Billah himself, a man of refined taste, beautiful handwriting, and catastrophic indecision. The second was his vizier, Ibn al-Alqami, a Shia Muslim serving a Sunni caliph, a man whose loyalties, depending on which historian you read, were either tragically misunderstood or deliberately treacherous. The third was Dawatar I-Beg, the commander of Baghdad's garrison, a career soldier, the only man in the room who understood what Hulagu's army actually meant. Hulagu sent al-Mustasim an ultimatum: surrender, tear down your walls, fill in your moat, and come before me in person, or face annihilation. Dawatar begged the caliph to act. He stood in the marble-floored audience chamber and argued until his voice cracked. He knew every detail of the Mongol advance, the numbers, the siege equipment, the speed. He had scouts reporting from every direction. He laid maps on the polished floor and traced the Mongol march route with his finger, pointing to each fallen city, showing the caliph exactly how long they had. Days, maybe weeks. The caliph looked at the maps. He nodded politely, and he called for more tea. Ibn al-Alqami counseled submission, arguing that the Mongols could be appeased with gifts and tribute. Al-Mustasim, suspended between his general's urgency and his vizier's calm, chose the most dangerous option of all. He did nothing. He sent a reply that was neither surrender nor defiance, a letter so inadequate that Hulagu reportedly read it aloud to his generals and laughed. This is the fundamental delusion that kills civilizations, the belief that past glory guarantees future survival. The general begged, the vizier schemed, and the caliph did nothing. Now a word of caution about what happened behind the scenes. According to Sunni historians like Ibn Kathir, the vizier Ibn al-Alqami secretly sent messages to Hulagu, assuring him of minimal resistance. Worse, he quietly reduced Baghdad's garrison from tens of thousands of soldiers to a fraction of its former strength, disbanding units, cutting funding, sending soldiers home. Shia historians tell a different story. They argue that the caliph's own incompetence was the real cause of Baghdad's fall, and that Ibn al-Alqami has been scapegoated for centuries. We present both perspectives because the deeper lesson is the same either way. Baghdad fell because of division within. Whether that division was one man's treachery or a society's collective failure, the result was identical. And an army does not disappear overnight. It erodes. Soldiers who are not paid go home. Officers who are not respected resign. The most effective destruction is always invisible until it is too late. By the time Hulagu arrived, Baghdad was defenseless. His army crossed into Iraq in late 1257. Cities and towns surrendered without a fight. The Mongol reputation alone was enough. Chinese engineers maneuvered siege equipment into position. The army was so vast that scouts could not see where it ended. Allah says in Surah Al-Hashr, they thought that their fortresses would protect them from Allah. But Allah came at them from where they did not expect. The people of Baghdad looked at their walls, ancient, thick, famous, and believed those walls were enough. But walls are only as strong as the men who stand on them. On January 29, 1258, the Mongol army arrived at the walls of Baghdad. The greatest city on earth looked up and saw the end. Otrar knew the walls would not hold. He understood that waiting behind stone walls against an enemy with Chinese siege engineers and limitless manpower was not a strategy. It was a death sentence in slow motion. So he did the only thing a soldier could do. He attacked. With approximately 20,000 men, all that remained of the once great Abbasid army, Otrar rode out of Baghdad's eastern gate on a sortie. Before riding out, he addressed his cavalry. He did not promise victory. He did not quote poetry or invoke the glory of the Caliphate. He simply told them that this is what soldiers do. He mounted his horse. His men mounted theirs. The gate opened, and 20,000 men rode toward an army that outnumbered them 7-1. Knowing exactly what the numbers meant, at first, the gamble seemed to work. The Abbasid cavalry pushed the Mongol vanguard back. For a brief, breathless moment, the defenders of Baghdad tasted something they had almost forgotten: hope. Then Hulagu played his card. His engineers broke the dikes. The canals, the ancient irrigation network that the Abbasids' own ancestors had designed and built, were breached. Water surged across the plain behind the Abbasid force, cutting off their retreat. Thousands of Muslim soldiers drowned in the very canals their forefathers had engineered. The infrastructure of civilization had been turned into an instrument of death. Otrar survived the field, but the defeat sealed Baghdad's fate. The last fighting force was gone. He had ridden out because a soldier's duty does not expire when victory becomes impossible. And the caliph who had sent him out with a fraction of what he needed was sitting in his palace when the hooves hit the mud. In a story filled with cowardice and complacency, Otrar Ibeg is the only figure who honors his oath. Someone fought for Baghdad. It just wasn't the man on the throne. After the failed sortie, Baghdad had nothing left between its people and the Mongol army, except stone walls and prayer. The bombardment began in early February 1258. Mongol catapults rose of them, positioned in a crescent around the eastern side of the city, launched a continuous rain of stones and naphtha fire. Stones crashed through rooftops. The naphtha spread fire across entire neighborhoods. The eastern wall began to crack under the relentless pounding. Inside the city, the sound never stopped. And in the House of Wisdom, a different kind of battle was being fought. In those final hours before the breach, a cluster of scholars worked with the desperate speed of people who understand exactly what is about to be lost. Some buried manuscripts in the gardens behind the building, wrapping them in oilcloth and pressing them into the earth. Others lowered volumes into wells, hoping the water would preserve what fire would destroy. One old man, described in multiple accounts, sat at his desk, still writing. As catapult stones crashed through the walls around him, these are the anonymous heroes of Baghdad's fall. History remembers the generals and the caliphs. But it was these scholars who built everything worth destroying. Their final act, trying to save books as the world ended, tells us everything about what the Islamic Golden Age actually was. A civilization that valued ideas enough to die for them. They were trying to save 500 years of human thought. They had hours. On or around February 5, 1258, the eastern wall collapsed. Mongol soldiers poured through the gap. The remaining defenders, mostly volunteers who had never trained for this, fought with swords and bare hands. They were overwhelmed within hours. And the people of Baghdad ran. They went to the mosques. They went to God's houses because there was nowhere else. Families crowded into prayer halls, children pressed against walls, old men knelt facing the Qibla, the direction of Mecca, murmuring prayers they had known since childhood. They believed that no army would violate a place of worship. They did not know the Mongols. They did not know that Hulagu's army had already burned the mosques of Bukhara, Samarkand, and Nishapur without hesitation. They went to the mosques because that is where Muslims go when everything else fails. And the doors held for a while, and then they didn't. What followed was weeks of horror. For days that turned to weeks, the sources vary. The Mongol army was given free reign over the city. Libraries were set alight, hospitals collapsed into their own foundations. The grand mosque's minaret toppled. The Tigris ran first black with the ink of dissolved manuscripts, then red. Bodies piled so high in places that, according to some accounts, they were used as makeshift bridges. The stench became so unbearable that Hulagu himself moved his camp upwind. Allah says in Surah Al-Anfal, "And fear a trial which will not strike those who have wronged among you exclusively." The massacre did not distinguish between the guilty and the innocent, the scholar and the child in the street. The trial fell on everyone because that is what happens when a society fails collectively. And yet, in the midst of this universal slaughter, something strange happened. Hulagu's wife, Dokuz Khatun, was a devout Nestorian Christian. While Baghdad burned, she went to her husband and asked for one thing: spare the Christians. He agreed. Dokuz Khatun sent her personal guards to the Nestorian church and the patriarch's residence. When Mongol soldiers approached carrying torches, her guards turned them away. Inside, Iraqi Christians huddled, some of them neighbors of the Muslim scholars now being killed in the streets only blocks away. They survived because one woman spoke. Reality refuses to be clean. In the middle of a genocide, one group was given shelter because one woman had access to power. Her act saved lives, real, human lives. But it also highlights the arbitrary nature of mass violence. One community spared not because of righteousness, but because of proximity to power. And then the Mongols reached the House of Wisdom. Every manuscript, instrument, chart, and encyclopedia carried to the banks of the Tigris and thrown in. The ink discolored the water for days. The current carried traces of dissolved text downstream. Past villages and fishermen who had no idea what they were watching float past them. We cannot imagine what was lost, not fully, because the records of what was in the House of Wisdom were themselves destroyed. We know fragments, the works on algebra, the translations of Aristotle, the astronomical tables, but those are only what survived through copies in other libraries. What was unique to Baghdad? What manuscripts existed in only one copy? We will never know. That is the true horror of the Tigris running black. Not just the books we lost, but the books we don't even know we lost. The death of a library is invisible. It looks like colored water. After the weeks of horror, after the libraries turned to ash and the river turned to ink, and the mosques turned to slaughterhouses, they brought the caliph before the conqueror. Al-Mustasim Billah was dragged from his palace in chains. His robes were torn. The man who had presided over the most powerful Sunni court in the world could barely stand. And Hulagu did something extraordinary. He ordered the hoarded wealth of the Abbasid treasury to be piled before the caliph. Plates of gold, goblets, coins, ingots, heaped on the ground, in front of the man who had kept it locked away while his city burned.
Eat. It cannot be eaten.
The caliph whispered.
Then why did you hoard it?
Hulagu's voice was flat.
Why did you not use it to pay for soldiers? Why did you not melt it into arrowheads? Why did you not pour it from your walls to buy the loyalty of men who would fight for you?
The Caliph had no answer. The Mongol conqueror, the man who just burned Baghdad to the ground, had diagnosed the failure more accurately than the Caliph's own advisors. He could have melted the gold into arrowheads. He could have hired mercenaries by the tens of thousands. He could have sent it to the Mamluk Sultan as payment for a relief army. Instead, he kept it in a vault while his people died. When your enemy understands your failure better than you do, that is the final humiliation. On or around February 20th, 1258, Hulagu ordered the execution of the last Abbasid Caliph. Mongol superstition forbade spilling royal blood on the earth. For the blood of the civilians in the streets, no such consideration applied, but for the Caliph, courtesy was required. So they wrapped him in a carpet and trampled him to death with horses. His sons were killed alongside him. The Abbasid Caliphate, 508 years, 20 generations of caliphs. From revolution to this carpet, this field, these horses, 5 centuries of governance, scholarship, law, theology, science, poetry, reduced to a man being rolled into a rug, because his executioner's superstition would not allow his blood to touch the earth. And just like that, it was over. Silence. The massacre ended not because of mercy. It ended because there was no one left. The city that had been home to over 1 million people was empty. The canals were clogged with corpses. The irrigation network that had sustained Mesopotamian agriculture for millennia was destroyed so thoroughly that the region's farming would not recover for centuries. Some scholars have traced Iraq's modern water challenges directly back to the infrastructure shattered in 1258. What does the silence after a civilization ends sound like? Baghdad had been the loudest city in the world, the adhan from 1,000 minarets. The arguments of scholars in the House of Wisdom, the hammering of blacksmiths, the splash of children in the canals on summer afternoons, and now wind through empty streets, doors hanging open on houses where no one would ever live again, the canals running silent. Silence is not the absence of sound, it is the presence of loss. For the first time in 5 centuries, there was no caliph, no House of Wisdom, no Baghdad. And here is the question that every believer asks when they hear this story, the question that hung in the air over those empty streets like smoke. Where was Allah? The answer is in Surah Ar-Ra'd, verse 11. And it is not the answer most people expect. Indeed, Allah will not change the condition of a people until they change what is in themselves. This is not a verse about punishment. It is a verse about responsibility. The Mongols did not destroy Baghdad. The Mongols were the instrument. Baghdad destroyed Baghdad through complacency, corruption, and the slow, quiet decision made every day by every person who could have acted and didn't, to let someone else worry about the walls. But this is not where the story ends, because what happened next is perhaps even more remarkable than the fall itself. They had lost everything. The Caliphate, the House of Wisdom, the city itself. The center of the Islamic world was gone. Most people assume the fall of Baghdad was the end of Islam. It wasn't even close. As Baghdad burned, scholars who had fled, clutching manuscripts, carrying the knowledge of centuries in their arms, made their way south and west, to Damascus, to Cairo, to the libraries and madrasas of Egypt and the Levant. They carried with them the seeds of everything the Mongols had tried to destroy. And in Egypt an army was forming. Not an army of sultans or princes, an army of former slaves. The Mamluks, men who had been bought as boys from the steppes and the Caucasus, trained in the arts of war, and who had risen through the ranks to become Egypt's ruling class, looked at the Mongol advance and did something no other power on earth had done. They refused to run. Sultan Qutuz summoned his commanders. The debate was fierce. Some argued for retreat. Others argued for negotiation. Some argued that fighting the Mongols was suicide, that no army had ever beaten them in the open field. Qutuz listened, and when every voice in the room had counseled caution or cowardice, he stood, removed his helmet, and threw it to the ground.
If no one else will fight the Tartars, I will go alone.
The room went silent. Then one by one the commanders picked up their weapons. This is the opposite of al-Mutasim. Where the caliph chose inaction, the Mamluk sultan chose action at any cost. One man sat on a throne he had inherited and watched his city die. Another, a man who had once been sold in a slave market, threw his crown to the floor and dared his generals to follow him. Leadership, real leadership, is not inherited, it is chosen. In September of 1260, the Mamluk army met the Mongol advance force under the general Kitbuka at Ain Jalut in the Galilee. And for the first time in living memory, a Mongol army was routed. The myth of invincibility, the terror that had paralyzed every nation from China to Persia, shattered on a Palestinian battlefield at the hands of former slaves. The world learned that the Mongols could bleed. The Mamluk Sultanate would become the new center of Sunni Islam. The scholars who fled Baghdad found refuge in Cairo. And the faith would not just survive, it would rebuild. But the most astonishing chapter was still to come. Within decades of Baghdad's fall, Hulagu's own descendants, the Ilkhanate, the Mongol rulers of Persia and Iraq, converted to Islam. Ghazan Khan, Hulagu's great-grandson, formally embraced the faith in 1295. Barely 37 years after the sack, he rebuilt mosques, he patronized Islamic scholars, he governed by Islamic law. The grandchildren of the man who burned the House of Wisdom prayed in the mosques their grandfather had destroyed. How do you explain a conquered faith conquering its conqueror? They plan, and Allah plans, and Allah is the best of planners. The empire fell, the caliphate ended, the library burned. But the faith did not die. It never does. So what do we do with this story? Do we mourn what was lost? Yes. Do we honor the scholars who died with books in their arms? Yes. Do we remember Otrar who rode out knowing he would never come back? Yes. But the real lesson is about us. Are we maintaining our walls, or are we sitting in our palaces, trusting our name to protect us? Indeed, Allah will not change the condition of a people until they change what is in themselves. That was true in 1258. It is true right now. Now, there is one more story to tell. We told you that no army had ever beaten the Mongols in the open field. That the very name Mongol was a death sentence whispered from China to Egypt. That the greatest empires on earth had all crumbled before them. And then a man who had once been sold in a slave market threw his helmet to the ground and said, "I will go alone." What happened at Ain Jalut, the battle that changed everything, is a story of its own. We'll tell it in the next episode, inshallah. Stay tuned.